By the last week of April 1893, in Jackson Park on Chicago's South Side, the fairgrounds are still wet at the edges. Lake Michigan wind pushes a thin grit across the paths, and men in work coats move in and out of doorways that look less like entrances than like gates. The official plan is clear. The World's Columbian Exposition will open on May 1st, 1893, a 6-month city built to demonstrate American modernity, industry, electricity, order. The documents call the structures temporary, yet the photographs clean facades, deep shadows, under arches, broad stairs, often read as permanence. A visitor who only sees the image could mistake it for a capital that has always existed. One detail keeps repeating in the visual record: oversized portals. Some are ceremonial, framed by columns and statuary. Others are plainly functional, wide openings that could swallow wagons, crates, or entire lines of people. In modern retellings, those giant doorways become a provocation. If the buildings were built for ordinary visitors, why do so many thresholds feel scaled for something else? That question is not an artifact in any official catalogue. It is a feeling produced by proportion, by the way a human figure looks small against the hinge line. The fair's construction methods help explain the illusion. Contemporary summaries describe steel-framed exhibition halls, dressed in staff, a fast, moldable mixture used to create ornate facades that could be whitewashed and made to glow at night under electric bulbs. But the same explanation, repeated often, creates its own quiet contradiction. Why build a temporary skin so convincing it resembles stone, complete with entrances built like fortress gates? The camera lingers on a doorway and the shadow inside it. The narration reads the official word temporary, while the image suggests wait. A faint electrical hum seems to live in the scene, not audible in the photograph but implied by the lights. The frame holds. Then, at the edge of the print, a bright reflection like a small flicker breaks across the arch. On May 1st, 1893, as the exposition opens in Jackson Park, Chicago, the official narrative presents a controlled spectacle. Nearly 200 new buildings arranged around water, classical in style, designed to handle crowds measured in the millions. The guidebooks and planning documents emphasize pedagogy and order, industry and progress given architectural form, while the buildings themselves are explicitly described as intended to be temporary. The visual anchor is a familiar artifact: the fair photograph, bright facades, deep-set arches, doorways tall enough to admit wagons and equipment, into halls dedicated to agriculture, machinery, and electricity. Wind off the lake lifts dust into the door recesses. It collects at thresholds like a soft line of static. The acoustic motif arrives as suggestion, the low, continuous murmur of a powered city, implied by lighting and by the scale of the interiors beyond those doors. Archival tension, at this stage, is not a missing record but a mismatch of language, temporary in text, monumental in image. The records themselves are consistent about intent. The contradiction lives in interpretation, in how ornament and mass persuade the eye. Contemporary commentary survives in paraphrase. Visitors repeatedly describe the fair as a city that seemed to appear fully formed, an environment that felt older than its construction schedule. The documentary treats this as a documented cultural reaction rather than a single verified quotation. A speculative observation enters carefully. Some alternative readings treat these gates as leftovers, not proof, but a pattern worth testing, arguing that the fair may have showcased or replicated an earlier architectural language whose original purpose is no longer stated in the paperwork. The unanswered timestamp unease begins gently. The fair is dedicated in October 1892, but the public opening is May 1893, a split that reminds us how easily a city can exist on paper, long before it exists as a lived space. Modern visitors still walk through museum-scale doors in civic buildings descended from this era's design logic. The question remains softly: if these thresholds were built for the modern human body, why do they so often read like entrances built for something larger? On October 13th, 1877, at Park Avenue between 66th and 67th Streets in Manhattan, the cornerstone ceremony for the 7th Regiment's Armory marks a specific institutional purpose: military readiness and civic display. The building that follows opened formally in September 1880, is designed with defensive features and an entry sequence that makes scale explicit, gates and thick doors, sized so a formation can pass through without breaking its line. The artifact anchor is architectural, not mystical. The entryway itself, plus the drill hall behind it, an enormous, largely unobstructed interior volume. The environmental element is late-year New York air, cold enough that metal feels sharper to the touch, while the sound motif becomes concrete. The heavy hinge, the dull thud of oak, the brief echo inside a hall built to hold marching feet. Here, the archival tension is also a date tension. Some authoritative summaries describe the Armory as built between 1877 and 1881, while other accounts emphasize the 1880 opening, both true in different senses, but the discrepancy is the kind that later fuels misreadings. The documentary does not exploit the mismatch as proof, it uses it as a lesson. Timestamps drift when buildings evolve. A human trace appears not as a diary but as institutional description, an official insistence on doorway width, on thickness, on the choreography of entry. Alternative interpreters sometimes point to armories and drill halls as technology temples, arguing that their volumes and materials imply acoustic intention beyond drill resonance, synchronization, bodily conditioning. The factual counterweight remains. The known uses include training and later large public events. Large doors are function before metaphor. The building is now widely recognized as a cultural venue, yet the doors still carry the original logic movement of groups, not individuals. The door sized for 4 abreast stands open to an empty threshold, asking whether who it was built for is sometimes simply crowds, equipment, and institutions, until a different reading arrives later to inhabit the same frame. On February 15th, 1868, an illustration in the Illustrated London News shows the St. Pancras train shed under construction on Euston Road, iron arches rising, scaffolding moving forward, and almost casually, an enormous pipe identified as part of the Fleet sewer system cutting through the scene. The artifact anchor is the engineering image itself, a modern city assembling its roofline from iron and glass, while older infrastructure runs beneath. The environmental element is London winter wet air, soot, and the feeling of cold metal. The sound motif is layered, hammering above, the implied rush of flow below, a kind of 2-level hum. The official story is straightforward. The station's train shed was a Victorian engineering feat, and the broader complex includes the hotel frontage that opens later, in 1873, a clean, documented split between the station's functional core and its architectural face. The documentary uses that split as a recurring pattern: function and facade, machine and myth. Archival tension here is not missing documentation, but the temptation of misinterpretation. A viewer sees the scale arches spanning extraordinary widths and imagines lost capabilities. The records, however, are consistent in naming the engineers and the intent, transport, capacity, and structural innovation. Contemporaries repeatedly frame such stations as monuments of their age, temples of movement, because people tend to speak that way when confronted with scale. In alternative readings, stations become portals, in a literal sense, thresholds, where energy, mass transit, and resonance converge. Modern commuters still pass through these oversized apertures, without noticing how deliberately they were designed to move multitudes. The camera returns to the 1868 image, the giant pipe half buried, the arch half built. If the modern city is always built on layers, how many doorways are actually transitions between eras, visible above ground, but explained by what remains hidden below? The official story closes, but the architecture keeps asking questions the paper never intended. On January 26, 1858, in downtown Chicago at the corner of Randolph Street and Dearborn Street. Newspapers report an engineering act that sounds like folklore until you see the documentation. A 4-story masonry building, lifted roughly 6 feet on jack screws, without the slightest injury to the structure. The broader project street grades raised across parts of the city responds to drainage, disease, and the need to install sewers in a low-lying landscape. The artifact anchor is twofold: the written reports of the period and the visuals that later circulate images of buildings suspended above ground while people continue their routines. The environmental element is Chicago mud and standing water conditions that made the intervention politically urgent. The sound motif is mechanical: the slow, repeated turn of jacks, a creak that is not dramatic but relentless. Here, the giant doorway question changes shape. When a street rises, a doorway does not shrink, but its relationship to the body does. Some steps become steeper, some entrances become basement openings, some original thresholds are abandoned or reframed. Later retellings of the project preserve a human witness trace. Observers noted how the everyday experience of entering a building changed as elevation changed, an ordinary complaint that becomes, in hindsight, a clue about why older doors often look wrong today. The chapter's archival tension is timestamp drift. Some accounts emphasize 1855 as the launch of the grading scheme, while specific major masonry raising reporting appears in 1858. That is not a contradiction so much as a reminder that start dates are often political labels. The documentary states the record as consistent, then shows how later audiences compress timelines. Alternative readings sometimes interpret buried doors as evidence of an older catastrophe narrative. The documented record, in Chicago's case, shows deliberate raising and reconstruction. Basement windows and half-submerged arches in older districts can be read, first, as infrastructure history, before they are read as mystery. An old entrance now below the sidewalk line, its lintel intact. When you see a doorway that feels too large or too low, are you seeing a different species, or simply a city that moved? By 1881, in Boston, civil engineers produced plan sets, mapping what the Back Bay had been and what it was, becoming an urban district built almost entirely on filled tidal flats and reshaped across decades. The development is documented as one of the major 19th century landmaking operations: dam projects, stagnant basins, and an enormous logistical movement of earth to create streets where water once sat. The artifact anchor here is the map sequence: drawings that show shorelines shifting, basins divided, and over time, a city grid replacing mudflats. The environmental element is the public health impetus that turns engineering into civic necessity. The acoustic motif is subtler: the muffled quality of built land earth laid down, compacted, and then built over, turning the old sound of water into a quieter, contained city. In the giant doorway frame, Back Bay is not about overbuilt portals but about how ground truth changes. When grade and ground are manufactured, entrances and steps are designed to meet a new baseline. Later, when viewers encounter misalignments, stairs that feel oddly tall, windows that sit too close to the sidewalk, they sometimes interpret them as remnants of something older. The documentary clarifies: in Boston's Back Bay, the records are consistent about landmaking. The mystery is how thoroughly the city's surface was rewritten. A human trace appears as a bibliographic footprint. Historians and planners document the project through maps and narratives. The voices are not romantic but administrative: how to divide control, how to move, fill, how to finance the transformation. The timestamp unease comes from the long span. Projects begin early, with dam work completed in the 1820s, yet the residential district is built out across later decades, creating the illusion of sudden emergence when it is layered time. Alternative readings sometimes treat made land as cover for buried structures. The documentary marks that as interpretation and returns to the documented engineering maps, dates, and visible urban planning traces. Modern cities still create land, still raise grades, still turn former waterlines into sidewalks. If a city can be manufactured shoreline to street, how confident should we be that the normal scale of doors and foundations is a stable reference across time? In 1891, construction accelerates in Jackson Park, Chicago, and the documentary slows down to examine a specific material fact. The exposition's major buildings are widely described as steel-framed structures dressed with staff, a mixture used to mold ornament quickly, then whitewashed to unify the fair's visual identity. The artifact anchor is the facade detail, molded reliefs, columns, and, crucially, the door surrounds frames elaborate enough to suggest stone carving, even when the substrate is temporary. The environmental element is practical: dust from construction, damp air near the lagoons, and the changing light that makes staff surfaces read differently in photographs than in person. The sound motif returns, the electrical hum promised by the fair's nighttime glow, a soft vibration implied by infrastructure. The archival tension is interpretive, and the documentary names it openly. Temporary does not always look temporary. The record is consistent that the fair was meant to be dismantled. The visual contradiction is that the gates, stairs, and portals were built with the language of capitals' entrances that feel like they should outlast their own paperwork. A human witness trace is anchored in institutional ambition. Planners intended the fair to declare an American century, and architecture is used as rhetoric grandeurs, as the physical punctuation of a narrative about power. The time-stamp unease is again split. Dedication: October 1892. Opening May 1893. Closing October 1893. A city that lives less than a year, yet leaves an image footprint that behaves like eternity. Alternative viewers often treat staff as camouflage, an argument that ornate facades could have been a skin over older cores. The documentary cannot verify that claim for the fair buildings as a category. It labels the idea and returns to what is documented. The fair was a deliberate, modern construction experiment. Modern experience architecture also builds temporary worlds that photograph as permanent. A doorway in close-up. The threshold shadow is deeper than it should be for a building that is supposed to vanish. Why does the language of permanence keep appearing at the exact places where people cross from outside to inside? In the record, the city rises by plan and by Jack. In the image, it rises like memory too clean, too tall, too ready to be misread. On September 30th, 1880, when the Park Avenue Armory is formally opened in Manhattan, its drill hall represents a technical ambition, an enormous, largely unobstructed interior volume under a high, vaulted roof, an engineering solution for drill and mass assembly that resembles a train shed in structural logic. The artifact anchor is the hall itself: long spans, iron elements, and a scale that changes how sound behaves. The environmental element is indoor chill air that stratifies, warmer near the roof, colder at the floor. The recurring acoustic motif becomes explicit. Footfalls do not just sound, they accumulate, turning into a low composite reverberation. The documentary stays evidence first. Descriptions emphasize dimensions, materials, and defensive entrance design. The forgotten technology here is not a lost machine, but a public unfamiliarity with how 19th century builders used volume, iron, and geometry to control crowds and movement. A human trace appears as design labor, the blend of military function with social prestige. The timestamp unease returns. Built between 1877 and 1881, versus opened in 1880, a reminder that buildings have multiple birthdays, depending on what you count as real. Alternative readings often treat such halls as intentionally resonant chambers, places where synchronized movement and architecture combine into physiological effect. The documentary does not claim that outcome. It invites a testable curiosity. How does resonance change human perception in spaces designed for massed bodies? Modern arenas, terminals, and halls still use the same physics, often without calling it technology. The camera holds on the door again, not the decoration, but the void. If doors are sized for mass and spaces tuned for echo, are we looking at a forgotten science or simply a science we stopped noticing? The Armory stands as a threshold between two readings: the official purpose, documented in planning records, and the experiential effect that only the body can register. Both may be true. The archive preserves the former, the latter lives only in the visitor who walks through and feels, briefly, that the scale was meant for something beyond ordinary assembly. In 1868-era documentation of St. Pancras in London, the station is engineered at high level on a forest of cast-iron supports, creating a vast undercroft beneath the platforms. Histories explain that this space was deliberately designed for storage and goods handling. The artifact anchor is the undercroft, repeating columns, measured intervals, and the feeling of a hidden machine room under a public threshold. The environmental element is damp coolness, air that smells of stone and iron, even when the visible city above is crowded. The acoustic motif changes, a distant rumble from above, transmitted through structure, the low-frequency signature of mass transit. Archival tension is minimal. The records are coherent. The documentary says so plainly, because credibility matters. This is an example where mystery comes from viewer unfamiliarity with logistics, not from a documented gap. The human trace is institutional but precise. Railway architecture follows economics of freight and storage. The timestamp unease is architectural. The station's engineering narrative crystallizes in 1868, while the hotel frontage opens in 1873, giving the same complex two faces, machine and facade, years apart. Alternative readings sometimes treat undercrofts and repeating iron grids as evidence of an energy lattice or harmonic architecture. The documentary's counterweight is the documented commercial rationale: storage, goods, structure, while still allowing the aesthetic effect to stand. Repeating geometry can feel like intention beyond economics. Modern visitors still walk near spaces once dedicated to hidden logistics, now repurposed. When the cathedral is built for trains and the crypt is built for commerce, what exactly is the doorway a doorway to, and why does the scale still make the body feel incidental? The undercroft persists beneath the station, its iron columns holding the weight of a century and a half of passage. The paperwork explains everything. The feeling of standing among those columns, the sense that the space was designed for processes larger than human routine, explains something the paperwork never addresses. In August 1893, during the exposition in Chicago, the fair functions as an enormous public demonstration of modern electrical systems. Electricity becomes part of the architecture, facades and doorways designed to catch light, to turn entrances into luminous frames. The artifact anchor is the nighttime photograph and the exhibition narrative, light outlining arches, door surrounds turning into graphic symbols in a way daylight stone never could. The environmental element is warm summer air over water. The acoustic motif becomes an electrical metaphor: buzz, flicker, a steady tonal bed beneath the crowd. Archival tension remains interpretive. The records support the fair as modern technological demonstration. The alternative interpretation is what such demonstrations conceal or rewrite. A human trace appears through institutional ambition. Organizers seek to showcase national modernity and power architecture and electricity fused into a persuasive environment. The timestamp unease is subtle but real. The fair closes October 30th, 1893. Yet the image of the White City becomes enduring, reused as memory and template long after the physical structures are dismantled. Alternative readings argue that the 19th century's electric age is not merely invention but rediscovery, that architecture and resonance imply a missing layer of applied physics. The documentary does not certify that claim. It frames it as a hypothesis generated by the convergence of scale, material, and power. Modern cities still use light to stage entrances. We call it branding now. The camera drifts from a lit arch to the darkness inside it. If electricity can transform a doorway into a symbol, what else can transform the meaning of scale without changing the stone at all? The technology may not be hidden. It may be embedded so common we stop naming it, until an old doorway makes the body feel like a measurement again. On October 30th, 1893. The World's Columbian Exposition closes in Chicago. Official summaries emphasize what follows. The fair was meant to be temporary, and most of its structures do not remain. The documentary treats silence as a consequence of impermanence. Dismantling destroys context. When buildings vanish, images harden into myth because they cannot be revisited at scale. The artifact anchor is the post-fair photograph. Empty courts. Doors that once admitted crowds, now opening onto stillness. The environmental element is late season, chill and wind across water. The acoustic motif is its absence, no hum, only the imagined echo of what was recorded in summer. The archival tension becomes physical. Demolition is an information erasing act, even when it is openly documented. The documentary refuses to claim secret removal. It states planned impermanence, then notes how easily audiences confuse gone with hidden. Alternative viewers treat the vanishing as suspicious. Why erase something so grand? The documentary holds the alternative reading carefully. The scale invites suspicion, but documented economics and intent explain much of the disappearance. World's fairs still build temporary cities. We are simply used to the concept now. A doorway framed in the last light. If the city was designed to vanish, what portion of its story vanishes automatically with it, especially the parts that can only be understood by walking through the gates? The silence that follows a fair is not conspiracy, but consequence. The buildings were never meant to answer questions in perpetuity. They were meant to perform for 6 months and then yield the ground. That the photographs remain while the thresholds do not is the source of every misreading that follows. An image without a body to walk through it becomes a different kind of evidence entirely. On June 15th, 1897, at Ellis Island in New York Harbor, a fire destroys the main immigration building of the first federal station. Records dating back to 1855 are lost in the blaze. No lives are lost in the incident as described in institutional histories, but something else is, the paperwork that made the past legible. The artifact anchor is a documented absence, burned manifests, and the bureaucratic gap that follows. The giant doorway theme becomes human. Millions pass through institutional thresholds, and the scale of the entrance is matched by the scale of the record-keeping, until fire makes the archive incomplete. The environmental element is smoke and salt air. The sound motif is emergency crackle, shouted orders, then the quiet that follows when paper is gone. Archival tension here is real and documented. Missing corpus, created by catastrophe, not conspiracy. The documentary treats this as a discipline. Sometimes the archive is silent because it was destroyed, and later interpretations must respect that boundary. In alternative readings, fires that erase archives are treated as pattern. The documentary labels this as interpretation and returns to mechanism. Fire destroys paper. Digitization reduces some risks and introduces others, but the principle remains: records are fragile. A doorway at the edge of water. If a threshold can process millions, and an archive can lose decades overnight, how many missing explanations about scale are simply missing because the paper could burn? The lesson is not that evidence was concealed. The lesson is that evidence is perishable. Every archive carries within it the memory of what was lost before cataloguing began. The doorway that processed so many people still stands, rebuilt, relocated, preserved, but the names that once passed through it exist now only in the memories of families who kept their own records. On December 15th, 1880, in the Park Avenue Armory's drill hall in Manhattan, an inaugural ball draws a crowd measured in the tens of thousands. The building's scale, once justified as military capacity, proves equally suited to spectacle, society, and public event. The artifact anchor is the hall in use, temporary lighting, polished floor, and the transformation of a drill space into a civic stage. The environmental element is winter warmth inside against cold outside, steam from coats, condensation on glass. The acoustic motif shifts from marching cadence to orchestral swell, but the physics is the same. Large volumes turn sound into presence. Archival tension is interpretive again, and the documentary states, The records are consistent. The Armory's documented uses expand over time. There is no hidden original purpose required to explain big doors when crowds and equipment already justify them. Yet this consistency is exactly where alternative viewers often push. If a building can swap functions so easily, perhaps its form is older than its paperwork. The documentary marks that as speculative and refuses to convert it into fact. Adaptive reuse is now common. Older buildings are routinely converted, while their thresholds remain. The entrance, framed by a different kind of line, not soldiers, not workers, but guests. If the same doorway can serve drill, freight, ceremony, and art, is who it was built for always a person, or is it sometimes the institution itself? The Armory persists as a cultural venue, its doors still scaled for formation. The paperwork explains the purpose. The experience of walking through the brief sensation that the threshold was built for processions larger than any modern gathering persists as a feeling the documents cannot address. Both truths coexist without resolution. On December 13th, 2025, in a quiet reading room where digitized photographs of the 1890s load on a screen one by one, the narrator returns to the original provocation. Giant doorways, repeated across cities and functions. The artifact anchor is modern but faithful. Scanned plates, engineering drawings, old maps, and institutional histories, enough to verify what was built, when it was built, and often why. The environmental element is sterile warmth, the faint hum of electronics, the soft click of a keyboard, a new kind of resonance replacing the old. The recurring motif becomes literal. Electricity now powers the archive that once documented electricity as spectacle. The documentary summarizes its evidence boundary. In Chicago, grade changes and building raising explain many buried entrances. In Boston, landmaking resets baselines. In London, the undercroft is logistics made monumental. In New York, the Armory doors are explicitly scaled for formation and mass. In Chicago's fair, staff facades explain the illusion of stone, while planned impermanence explains why so much vanished. And yet the alternative lens persists not as proof, but as an interpretive itch, a way of noticing patterns of scale, repetition, and silence that official narratives do not foreground. The documentary treats it seriously but carefully. The hypothesis must live downstream of evidence, not upstream of it. The final image is simple: a photograph of a doorway, tall enough to feel excessive, ordinary enough to be ignored. The narration ends without declaring a verdict. If the archive can explain the engineering, but not fully explain the feeling, what exactly are we measuring when we measure a threshold? The reel holds on the dark interior beyond the door and cuts mid-frame. History can document why a door was built. It rarely documents why it still feels like a gate.